Welcome to a Mackenzie Institute Long Talk. Two of the Mackenzie Institute's favorite venues are within a short walk of this spot. South on University Avenue, the Royal Canadian Military Institute. Here, the front door of the University of Toronto Faculty Club. Well, we had Keith Boag at an event a while back to talk about the midterm elections. But we've also cornered him to talk about the 2020 elections. Keith Boag is CBC's Washington correspondent who's also been based in Los Angeles, Ottawa, South Africa, and Vancouver. He knows Canada, he knows America, and now we're all going to know a little more about how 2020 may transpire. It's said that Americans were so distrustful of kings and powerful government that they designed a government that doesn't work. Is that a fair comment?
It's a fairer comment now than it might have been at other points in history, I think. I don't remember a time since I've been covering Washington, which began in the 1990s, where people have been saying after every election that produces divided government, that it by definition means gridlock. Even though that's not necessarily true, it's come to be believed that it just doesn't work.
Well, the Kennedy-Nixon debate was about the closest in history to that time. It has been divided long before Trump. Mm-hmm. What's so new and different and challenging about these days?
I think the most obvious thing about these days predates Trump by some, couple of years. But in the 2010 election, when the Tea Party began to take over the Republican Party and become a substantial presence in the Republican caucus, the Republican Party as a governing party ceased to function. There are threats to the Democratic Party that are similar, and maybe they're not as mature as the one that happened in the Republican Party, but it's not there yet. But we have just seen, we're at the end of the first 2 years of Republicans having the White House and both houses of Congress, and effectively being unable to govern on so many issues, including their key issue, which was to repeal and replace Obamacare, which they talked about for 7 years, and which they tried earnestly to do by some counts, let's say 3 times, some would say more, depending on where the initiative began. But they were unable to do it. And they're unable to do it because a large part of their House caucus has been kind of infected by this media feedback loop on the right that doesn't quite exist on the left in the same form at all, but that has led so many of them to believe in a different reality from the one they have to deal with when they're in Washington. The media component of this, I think, may be looked back historically as being the most important element of it. It is the media component of it that created the Tea Party, that created the Freedom Caucus, as it's called now, in the Republican Party, in the House caucus. And that is the obstacle to effective government when you have all the power there is to have in Washington. That is the reason that Donald Trump blames Democrats, because he treats it as a given that his party is incapable of governing, and so they need the support of Democrats, and so that everything is their fault, which of course is absurd. But the logic to it rests in this problem that Republicans have in their caucus.
Now, I'm not sure I quite understand the role of the media, but just to push back a little, mm-hmm. It was the media that created John F. Kennedy, and some say had he not been elected, he would have gone down in history as being famous for being well known. Mm-hmm. Had Trump not gotten elected, it would have been a publicity stunt for a reality show. Mm-hmm. So speak again to what's new about the media feedback loop, as you call it.
Okay, sure. There's a new book out called Network Propaganda that takes apart what happened to the media in the period just prior to the 2016 election up until this current moment. So say about 2014-15 with the development of what it calls a closed right-wing media ecosystem. The roots of it are really in the populist programming of Rush Limbaugh, who becomes one of the most popular, listened to, influential voices on the right beginning in the 1980s. But it leads us to a point where, in a network propaganda, they break this down and support it with data. That on the left you have media establishments that are influential, such as the New York Times, PBS, BBC, and they name one, NPR. Those are the standards that set the discussion, the narrative on the left, from the center to the left. On the right, the corresponding things that have the same influence are Fox News, Sean Hannity, which they separate out as an individual distinct from Fox News, even though that's where he works, Breitbart, Gateway Pundit, Daily Caller. I mean, there's just no equivalence between those two things. On the right, you have media institutions that are respected in alt-right circles or far-right circles that engaged in conspiracy theories about, Seth Rich and how the Democrats had him murdered, for instance, an absurd proposition that they will not let go of. And at the same time, voices that you and I grew up with on the right. George Will is still around and working, but he has no place in the right-wing media anymore. He appears
on
now
the left-wing media.
Yeah, I mean, he's not a Democrat. He is recoiling in horror at what has happened to his party. But he appears now on MSNBC. Younger people, Max Boot, who is a writer and public intellectual, doesn't appear in right-wing media at all, even though he's a conservative. He's another example of someone who appears on MSNBC. Something is really wrong with media in the United States when that happens. And we cannot underestimate, I don't think, the importance and the influence of media in all democracies for shaping public debate. So where we are in the US, just to finish that point, is that you have distinct and separate narratives about what is going on in the country. And that leads to a set of priorities that's out of sync. There is no national consensus on what the priorities of American government should be at this moment.
And to go into the Wayback Machine, Walter Cronkite used to say, we don't have a shared experience anymore, or he would say, the shared experience is gone because of the fragmentation of the market. You've made your point well about the distinct aspect of right-wing media. There's one other thing that's changed. I.F. Stone's weekly independent journalist who coined the phrase, all governments lie. He went deaf, he had to read all government reports and found out that what was said at the news conference was different than what was actually in the report. We don't have such a source now, do we, in the middle or traversing those extremes?
I think there's a lot of good journalism being done. I think at this time in particular, we may even be in a golden age of journalism because access, which has been such an important part of political journalism for so long, has become meaningless. Having access to White House people who lie to you is not moving anything towards the goal line at all. So it has forced journalists to do things that are different in this administration. Not all of them get the attention that they should, but if I were to recommend one right now, Michael Lewis's book called The Fifth Risk, is the only thing that I've read that is seriously looking at what is happening to government in the United States under the Trump administration. It's not a polemic against Trump at all. It's an examination of what's going on in the US Department of Agriculture, an examination of what's going on in the Energy Department, what really is happening there, how they are suffering from not benign neglect, a lack of funding, not filling in spaces that need to be filled, and then the more destructive and active destructive measures that are being taken to undermine the core goals of those departments.
Now you just used the L word, the word that New York Times was very reluctant to start printing. But let me push back on that too. When Trump lies, it seems to be about preposterously inconsequential things. His hands, the size of the crowd at his inauguration, whether he said something or didn't say something, whether Elizabeth Warren is part Indigenous or not, and whether he's going to pay $1 million to a charity as a result. When, even going back as far as Eisenhower lied, Laos became the most bombed country in the world, including those in World War II. When Kennedy lied, we probably had regime change in South Vietnam. When Johnson lied, troop strength doubled. Gulf of Tonkin resolution, with which he waged war, was a lie. When Nixon lied, he may have violated the Logan Act and done secret deals with the North. So why are we so exorcised over Trump's inconsequential lies when they can't directly be tied to wars or death?
Because I think they aren't inconsequential, even if they aren't consequential in the ways that you mentioned with the examples that you've laid out. Those are obviously important things. But I think the suspicion is that Trump is trying to create a new reality, a reality that will allow him to do whatever he wants to do. It is a fundamental it is one of the foundations of authoritarianism, that the truth is what you say it is. And I think that people believe that it is exactly the smallness of the lies, the fact that why would he lie about something so inconsequential? That is the tip-off that we should be really worried about what is happening
We're waiting for the bigger lies.
I think it's not so much waiting for the bigger lies, although that is I think inevitable when we see more of Mueller and so on. I think it is so that he, in all kinds of areas that are important, not the least of which is the evident corruption of the government and his family's involvement in that and his ties around the world through his businesses, that we just don't believe it. That there are all kinds of ways that lying works, for disinformation, for misinformation, but also for disorientation. And disorientation is what is the real threat from the Trump administration, to make you doubt everything, in particular to make you doubt your government. And that is the whole idea about the lies he tells about the deep state, is to undermine the credibility and thus the authority of the Department of Justice. I mean, that's not a little thing. That's more than the size of his hands, right? So that's why I use that word. That's why I think it's so important. And I also see this insular, isolated right-wing media ecosystem contributing mightily to that.
Let's take another parallel. People are startled at his instant tweets, all day, all night, middle of the night, etc. Some hateful, some inconsequential, some about sports and public entertainers. When John Kennedy ran live news conferences, people were aghast.
Yeah.
The president is saying this live around the world. It could change policy. Mm-hmm. Is there a legitimate new concern about tweets versus a live news conference?
I think the obvious thing is that even when Kennedy was giving a news conference, it still went through the gatekeepers of the television networks, right? There are no gatekeepers on Twitter, and that is something that has been the subject of complaint for reasons that predate Trump or have nothing to do with Trump. Twitter, Trump recognizes, is a powerful tool for him precisely because it has no gatekeepers, precisely because he can talk directly to his followers if they choose to listen. I think it's exaggerated maybe how much influence it has with those people, but it certainly has some influence with those people. But more important, everyone in the media follows it. It's a way of him creating news in a momentary way. Every 10 minutes, if he chooses to, he can create news with that. That's an extraordinary, powerful weapon in the hands of a president.
Irresistible. Now, so we got talking about the media when we began talking about the U.S. governmental system, and of course as the fourth estate and as a check on government and part of democracy, and Jefferson would rather have had media than government. Mm-hmm. So legitimate alleyway to go up. But then there's the governmental system. It is said that America doesn't really hold a national election. It holds 50 state elections and then makes a soup and aggregate out of the results. Talk for a bit about the system that to some Canadians is a bit weird, that you can have a primary with different rules in different states, aggregated in different ways, and 8 months later the winner of that aggregation faces the electorate 2 months after that, which may be so far down the road that particular candidate has lost the appeal, or a losing candidate has gained a lot of appeal. I mean, it does seem kind of weird to some. How about you?
Well, I guess living in the United States for as long as I have, I think I've been there for 12 years in total, 9 years straight now. I am continually learning how disunited the United States is, how much resistance there is against the idea of the United States in lots of states across the country. Some of this, a lot of it, is the residue of the Civil War. And I think we have seen recently how deeply held beliefs in what that war was really about are, and there are unbelievable divides on that issue, and how the Confederacy and the Confederate Army should be celebrated, and so on. And so you have a system that was designed to create a looser United States of America than we think of it today. And the institutions that grew up in that, I think, reflect it. But that's why the Gettysburg Address was so important, because not only did it have this great moral message about the righteousness of the fight, but it also began referring to the United States, not as a union, but as a nation, right? And I think that Lincoln was ahead of his time in that. And I also think in many parts of the country, it's still not viewed as a nation. But there are lots of other things to say about the question that you've asked. That
Well,
was really, the government was designed to be distrustful of the people. Only the House of Representatives in the Constitution at the beginning was elected by the people. The Senate was appointed by the states, and the president was chosen by the Electoral College. They didn't trust the people very much.
Right, and by the way, rightly so. You anticipated my next couple of questions, and I shouldn't be at all surprised. I was going to say that it is said you can't understand America unless you understand New York and the Civil War. So you started with the Civil War. Johnson rightly said he was going to lose, the Democrats were going to lose the South for a generation, and he's into his second generation of loss now. But the last midterm election held out some hope for black and Democratic candidates in the South at a number of different levels. Is that still something that they feel they can build on, and is it going to be a factor in 2020?
I think two things happened. One, there were some really strong narratives for popular candidacies, such as an African-American governor in Florida, an African-American woman governor in Georgia. Neither of those, as we speak now, came to fruition. But there were lots of other things going on in the electorate that didn't get such high profile attention during the campaign that I think can encourage people to believe.
Texas state results.
Texas state results. I mean, things are changing in Texas. We seem to be led down the path every election now that Texas is either shifting from a red state to a purple state or a purple state to a blue state. And it just doesn't happen, but it gets closer all the time. And I think, I might be wrong about this, I think it was Wendy Davis who first said that Texas is actually a blue state already. It's just a non-voting blue state. Anyway, to get back to your question, I think that the progress towards a more racially progressive country as a whole continues simply because of some of the discussions that are being had about it. But one of the reasons there is backlash against it, I think, is because it's succeeding. One of the reasons that you have this white identitarian politics and some of the ugly things like we saw in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. I mean, that represents, I think, some kind of convergence of groups who have found commonality through the presidency of Donald Trump. But I also think they're reacting against a battle that they've been losing for a long time.
Now,
and will continue to lose.
The American system is so complex, for me anyway, with the primary system and the aggregating of state votes for president and splitting the ticket and pulling the lever and voting for everybody of one party or not. In the last midterms, it was said that X million people, more people, voted Democratic in Senate races than Republican. But that's kind of like saying more people voted for maritime premiers who are of a particular political stripe than Western Canadian premiers of a different stripe, so isn't that illustrative of something? I don't find it illustrative of anything when people in one particular state, as the British would say, over-egg the cake or rack up a massive plurality, and another state is a squeaker. Have I missed the point of those analysts who are saying there's something there?
Well, the last midterm election for the Senate is a complicated thing to understand. I think if you asked people sort of generally what was their impression, they would say that Republicans won big in the Senate on November 6th. But really, you know, how many races were there and how many did they win? There were 35 races, and I think they won a third of them, and the other 2/3 were run by Democrats. What makes the difference is that the Senate race was essentially run in a different country from the United States that was voting in the House elections.
And in a different system.
Yes.
Mainly two people on the ballot.
Mainly two people,
50%
statewide
plus
votes.
one.
Yeah.
You're done.
But it was the battlegrounds were almost all in red states. The Democrats had their blue states and they won them. The Republicans had their red states and they won them. And then there were battles for that involved Democrats in red states, and that's where Democrats lost. And because the Senate is so close, it means that the Republicans continue to hold the majority in the Senate.
And for the Democrat who lost a narrow race in one state, a Democrat in another state winning handily doesn't really have any purchase on that close race next time.
Yeah, if you view it strictly through the lens of the voice of democracy and the people, it doesn't really help you understand what happened. What happened is strictly about power, and Republicans managed to maintain power in the Senate in the 2018 midterm, which means that they are going to have an easier time of maintaining that majority in 2020, because those people that they protected in 2018, and I think they're going to pick up too when it's all done. We don't know as we're speaking, but they're not up again until for another 6 years.
Irrelevant for 2020.
So those Senate seats are now in the bank for 2020 and for 2022. In 2024, they'll run again, but for 6 years, that is the kind of those are the aces they have in the hole.
Well, that's the Senate. The House, I don't know how you pronounce it, but apparently the person who invented the term gerrymandering, his first name was Gary, so some call it Garrymandering, including Ronald Reagan did. Whatever it is the bending out of shape of an electoral district to achieve the results that the ruling party wanted. I'm assuming Democrats have done as much of that as Republicans, but tell me about that, please.
Well, it depends when you look at it. The Democrats haven't had the opportunity to do as much as Republicans have, because the last redistricting happened after the 2010 census. In 2010, Republicans swept through a lot of state legislatures, held governorships that really hold the levers of power when it comes to deciding what the next district boundaries are going to look like. So in the last midterm elections, the gerrymandering heavily favored Republicans. And we repeated and repeated as we went into the campaign that the test for Democrats was to get a national popular vote in excess of 6 points. What we're essentially saying is that the playing field is so unlevel, so biased towards Republicans, that they start with a 6-point lead, and to have any hope of taking control of that chamber of the House of Representatives, Democrats had to do better than beat them just by 6 points. As it turns out, I think it's going to look like 7 or 8 points. That is a big win by any measure except one. It doesn't deliver a whole lot of seats. It delivered enough so that Democrats have control of the House. But I think it's pretty clear that if you flip the vote around, if Republicans had won that many votes, they would have had an enormous landslide of seats in that House. So there is an imbalance there. That's that's something to be concerned about, because there are other places in the government, as we know, where minorities are in charge. A president elected with a minority of the without winning the popular vote in the last election. A Senate, if you look at the majority and the population that it represents, and I know that's a distinct way from looking at it in terms of the way that it was designed. It wasn't intended to be that way, but nevertheless, you have a majority in the Senate represented by a minority of the population, and in dramatic circumstances, choosing to put a majority of their political viewpoint on the Supreme Court of the United States. So there are lots of things that are happening in the United States that are counter-majoritarian.
And it said the so-called Freedom Party, even in a smaller House, a smaller Republican House, has more power because it's exercising its influence over a smaller number of Republican incumbents.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that those who managed to succeed in the last midterm election in the Republican caucus are the most extreme people in that caucus. Those who lost with moderating forces, they're gone now. So what you have is an even more deeply divided representation in the House.
Let me just push on this term, control of the House or the Senate. Perhaps more relevant in the House than the Senate. But without party discipline, with the need to, with an inability really to whip your party, there needs to be some sort of media campaign or charisma or cajoling, as LBJ used, to get legislation passed. So in the American system, isn't having more members in a House a little less important than in Canada?
You mean as long as you have a majority?
Yes, but with so-called bipartisanship, you don't really have to vote party lines all the time, as John McCain showed us.
Yeah. Okay, so the two chambers operate differently, and the two parties operate differently within those chambers. So when Republicans are in control of the House, they invented something they called the Hastert Rule, which essentially tries to forbid legislation coming to the floor for a vote if it isn't clear that it's going to receive not only a majority of the support of the members, but a majority of the majority party. So this is why immigration reform that passed in the Senate in 2013, I think it was never brought to the floor in the House of Representatives by John Boehner or by Paul Ryan, because they knew it would pass if they brought it to the floor, but they knew it would not get a majority of Republican members, and thus it would violate the so-called really non-existent Hastert Rule. Now, we know the Democrats don't operate that way, and we know that because when Obama was president, he wanted fast-track authority to negotiate the Trans-Pacific, the TPP. He would not have been able to get that with a majority of Democrats in the House. So he relied on the Republicans, and a significant, the critical number of Democrats that he needed to make it a majority, but largely he relied on Republicans to do that. I think this concept of the Hastert Rule really, it forbids the kind of compromise that makes politics work for the people.
And how do they judge whether it is likely to pass by a majority of the majority party? Is it just a straw poll that the leaders take?
I mean, a good speaker, majority leader, and whip had better know what the numbers are. It's as LBJ, his great talent was he knew how to count.
He count, yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And the Kennedys couldn't.
Nancy Pelosi says that's what she learned at her father's knee, how to count.
Now, let's go to the other branches of government very briefly, but Trump was the oldest elected president. I remember when I think it was one of the commentators, perhaps Roger Mudd, said in '76, when Reagan didn't win, well, that's it for him, he'll be too old in '80. And of course, he had two successful terms after that. Why is nothing much made of Trump's age compared to what was made of Reagan's age?
Because he's a completely different kind of figure. There's so much to talk about with Donald Trump when you're talking about the free passes he gets on so many issues, right? Age is certainly one of them, but it's the least of them. The Trump presidency, the Trump nomination, first of all, and then the Trump presidency, don't fit into models. He is judged by a different standard. His untruthfulness is judged by a different standard. His business background is judged by a different standard. 5 children, 3 wives. I mean, only a white man could do that, but only a particular white man could do that. Barack Obama is not going to ever become the president of the United States if his CV is identical to Donald Trump's, nor is Hillary Clinton. I mean, the normal rules don't apply to Donald Trump.
Can he be reelected in 2020?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think you have to, if you look, as you are inclined to do, at the broad sweep of history, incumbency is the strongest advantage that you can have in a presidential contest.
As of almost nearing his lame duck period, he still has control over foreign policy, which the Senate has oversight over, and he has the Senate in his party column. He has control over judicial appointments. Does this mean he is going to have a lasting legacy like Johnson had with civil rights and Reagan had with ending the Cold War?
Well, I think that if you look at the expression on the faces of Republican senators, and particularly Mitch McConnell, they believe that the Trump presidency will go down in history as establishing, through the court system, and not just the Supreme Court system, but through the judiciary, a more conservative America, which is their fundamental goal. Mitch McConnell will take credit for that privately, but publicly, they're happy to give it to Donald Trump. And in foreign policy, this is not a static moment in time, as you well know. What Trump's interest and lack of interest in foreign policy means is that things unfold and develop in a different way on a permanent track. I guess the best example that people refer to is China. After the Trump presidency is over, the world doesn't snap back to pre-Trump and deal with China. The world is then dealing with a China that has changed dramatically in the Trump era. So those are the impacts. I mean, it's a very important presidency, and that's a very sad thing for a lot of people.
How do you like being interviewed instead of interviewing people?
You're really making me think. I think when I'm interviewing people, but it's a new experience for me. It's good.
Well, you're very kind to say that. That's not what I was trying to arrive at. What I was trying to arrive at was, you're the big time interviewer. What did I forget to ask you about? You'd know better than I.
One of the questions that I most frequently use as the last question is some variation of, if I haven't had the wit to ask you the proper question, answer it anyway.
Well, what's your answer?
Well,
then?
no, I've enjoyed talking to you, and I think that all of the things I care about are things that we talked about, and all the things we talked about are things that I care about. If we were to come back to any one of them, I think that I will always come back to how important I think it is to talk about what's happening to media right now and how that fits into the things that people find so worrisome about what's going on, not just in America, but in the world. I think we covered that, though, but that is, if you had not asked me about that, that would be my default answer.
Well, you did cover it, and well, and thank you. And the Mackenzie Institute is grateful, and I am grateful. We'll watch for you on TV. We are aware of your schedule, and how fitting a couple of hours into your schedule for us is not an inconsequential request, and you've agreed to it very graciously.
I've agreed to it graciously. You may say, I would say happily. Thank you for inviting me.
Pleasure. Any views expressed here are not necessarily those of the Mackenzie Institute, its speakers, sponsors, or supporters. But the Institute is dedicated to fostering public discussion, debate, and education about security matters. Google the Mackenzie Institute to join the discussion. The Mackenzie Institute is grateful to its sponsors and supporters. Some of our short pods and long talks are a result of the support of Heathbridge Capital Management Limited, the National Post, and Dundurn Publishing.